the whole landscape was entirely different. And suddenly it was very lush and green and filled with a meadow of flowers of colors you can't even imagine. And that these colors and this grass that was so vividly green all had light within it and all looked as though it were literally alive. And in the distance, I saw huge trees, and the trees with the beautiful green leaves. Everything was glowing from within and emanating out this light. And I was just so mesmerized with it. And the man that had asked me to follow him, I started to think of as a guide. And he had gone on ahead, and he telepathically spoke again and said, "Follow me."
My guest today is Karen Thomas, who not only saw her deceased loved ones, met her guides, had a life review, saw future events, but she also has the most unusual explanation for prayers that I have ever heard. And to say that I am excited is an understatement. So, Karen, welcome and thank you for joining us today.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate you having me here to join you.
Well, let's go ahead and dive in. And can you tell us the story that kind of started this all from your childhood?
Yes, I'd be glad to. And it's funny that you mentioned that, because I've met many near-death experiencers over the years. And as I've gotten to know them really well, I've found out that almost all of them have a backstory that ties to what happens to them later on when they have their near-death experience. And that certainly was the case with me. I had the unfortunate experience of being with my dad. I was only 7 years old at the time, and he and my mom were out in a fishing boat on the St. Lawrence River. And he had a massive heart attack and died. And it was really very, very traumatic. I was really close to my dad. He was only 48 years old. And so it was very traumatic in many ways, that the boat spun around in a circle. Someone had to come and help out, had to get the boat back to a dock. And anyway, I was sent from the boat and up to our car that was parked on land. And I was told to get out of my bathing suit, change into my clothes. So I was by myself in the back seat of our car. And as I was there, I began to pray for my dad to be alive, to survive this. And I, as a little kid, at only 7, I was really in. I had seen things like Lassie being prayed for, and Lassie lived, and I had seen things like that, and that was what I was thinking as I prayed and as I cried. And it wasn't to be. And my dad did pass away. And I actually knew it as we were coming back in the boat, but I still felt that I could turn that around somehow and somehow save him. And so that I prayed. But my prayer wasn't answered. At least that was how I interpreted it as a small child. And so I then also felt that something must not have been worthy enough in me for my prayer to be answered. And so I felt from that day forward that somehow I had to become more worthy, and somehow come to have God be pleased with me. And so that was kind of something that was within me throughout the rest of my life and prior to my near-death experience.
Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry that you had to witness that. I think that everybody watching can probably relate to praying and not having a prayer answered. I think it's part of the human condition. But for a 7-year-old to go through that, that had to have been so difficult.
Yeah, yeah, it really was. And, like I said, my dad and I had been particularly close. And, so it was very hard because my entire life changed after that. My mom was 50 years old and had never worked outside the home. And we lost our home that we were living in because there was no income to continue making a mortgage payment. And pretty much everything about my life was entirely different after that. So, yeah, it was really a traumatic thing.
Yeah, it sounds like it. So you're going along and now you have your own family. And will you share with us your NDE story?
Yes, I was married. I had become a physical therapist, and my husband and I had decided to sell our home in New York and move to Alaska on the suggestion of a friend of my husband's who had been his friend in the Navy. And at that time, the Prudhoe oil field situation was going on in Alaska, and my husband was a machinist. And so they thought, his friend thought that we would be able to find work and that we could begin a whole new life with our young children who were 9 and 6. And so we sold everything and moved to Alaska. And as I was working as a physical therapist there, I happened to injure my back. And so I had also injured my back 5 years before that and had a laminectomy done. And this time, there was concern that may not be able to do a laminectomy. I might have to have a spinal fusion. And that could very well mean the end of my career as a physical therapist. And so, I had belonged to a church there in Alaska, and I asked friends there if they would pray for me that I would not have to have this spinal fusion. I had been getting conservative care for it. It wasn't working. And so a surgeon decided surgery had to be done, but wasn't sure which surgery would end up being done. Also asked family members from back in New York and other people if they might pray for me. And um, and so that was kind of what was happening with me and why I was had done that. Um, so the day of the surgery, my husband and the 2 kids came to the hospital, and it was an early morning surgery. And so they were sent off to a waiting room, and I was taken in for my surgery. And that was during the surgery, when my near-death experience took place.
So you want to tell us about what happened?
Well, yes, I was put under anesthesia. I was on my stomach on the operating room table so that they could reopen the old incision from my back, and be able to decide what they needed to do, whether a laminectomy or a fusion, and perform the surgery. Of course, once I was under anesthesia, I wasn't aware of anything that was going on. But then suddenly I was conscious. And not only was I conscious, but I was way near the ceiling in this operating room, and so close that I was only inches away from ceiling tiles up in this corner of the operating room. And as I was up there, my consciousness was up there, I began hearing swearing and commotion and chaos going on. So I turned my attention to where all of this noise was coming from. And as I did, I could see them turning my body from being face down to being face up on this operating room table, and realizing that it was me that I was seeing. And that if I was being turned over my body, but I was conscious, that that must mean that I had died. I didn't know what was going on. I just felt this peace and lack of connection to this body that I saw being turned over. But I thought about my husband and my kids, and I thought, how can I let them know that I'm okay, that I'm alive, my self is still alive? And as I thought that, my consciousness literally moved through the wall of this operating room and out into a hallway outside the operating room, and retraced where the stretcher had taken me down this long hallway and back to the double doors that were the opening for the operating suite. And then through those double doors also I went. It was a very big suite of operating rooms. It was the #1 trauma center for Anchorage, Alaska. And so I had to go by lots of other operating rooms as I went out through, and then through these double doors and out into a hallway, and trying to find this waiting room that my husband and kids had been sent to. And as I did, my attention was drawn to a man in street clothes that was rushing in the opposite direction from the way I was going. And a telepathic voice spoke to me and said, pay attention to this man. And so as soon as that was said, I was up very, very close to him. And I could see the color of the jacket he was wearing and what his eye color was, and exactly what he looked like. And I began to hear his thoughts telepathically of needing to get into that operating suite. And then I saw him rush toward the double doors that I had come out of, and near the entrance to them, there was another man, and I began to hear his thoughts, and his thoughts were, what does this guy think he's doing? He's just a regular guy in street clothes, and he's trying to go into that operating suite area. And so I saw the first man slow down and stop for a bit, and then the double doors opened electronically and he went through, and I began to think again, I've got to find my husband and kids in the waiting room. And as I started to think that and go in the general direction I thought they may have been sent, I was no longer able to direct my own consciousness. And I literally felt myself being drawn upward instead of going down, continuing down this hallway. And I literally went up through the ceiling of that floor into the next floor of the hospital, through that floor until I was out completely out of the hospital, over and above the roof, up high enough that I was about the level of a small plane. And as I was at that point, instead of continuing to go higher, I began to be drawn very quickly over toward the city of Anchorage itself. And so I rushed, my body was moving very fast, though I felt no air going, flowing by me, no difference in temperature, nothing like that. And then as I got out to where Anchorage sits on water, this entire big black kind of tunnel-y looking, cave-looking thing opened up, and I was drawn inside it. And then once I was inside there, it was very, very, very dark, but way off in the distance, I could see like a little pinprick of light. And as I saw and I focused on it, I began moving just very, very, very fast toward it. So much so that this pinprick became bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger until I was pulled right into this enormous, bright, amazing light. And as I was pulled into the light, I was also filled with all this sense of love and compassion and peace. And the calmness that I felt was increased even more. And it was just overwhelming feelings. And once I was out there, I began to think, where is this? And so I looked down toward where I would think my feet would be and saw no feet, but saw a brown, arid, rocky sort of land. And the bright light was still everywhere. And as I'm puzzling over this, because I'm thinking, um, I thought if I'm dead, I'd be in heaven. And I surely didn't picture heaven to be looking like this deserty, dry area. And so, as I'm thinking this, another telepathic voice spoke and drew my attention off to my left. And going up a slope up out of this area that I had come out into was a man. And his thoughts were saying, "Follow me." And I was immediately just a few feet behind him and looking at the back of this man, trying to figure out who was he. And he had like a toga type of a garment on, and it was about mid-thigh, and he had almost black hair, and it was tied back like a ponytail, but with a piece of leather. And he had leather sandals on his feet and ties that went up his calves. And so my following thought, after I'm not in heaven, was, wait a minute, this man does not look like I imagined that Jesus would be. And I thought if I'm in heaven and if I died, that I would also be with Jesus. And yet I somehow knew that this man was not Jesus. But I followed him up over the slope. And as we both came up over the slope, the whole landscape was entirely different. And suddenly it was very lush and green and filled with a meadow of flowers of colors you can't even imagine. And that these colors and this grass that was so vividly green all had light within it and all looked as though it were literally alive. And in the distance, I saw huge trees, and the trees with the beautiful green leaves. Everything was glowing from within and emanating out this light. And I was just so mesmerized with it. And the man that had asked me to follow him, I started to think of as a guide. And he had gone on ahead, and he telepathically spoke again and said, "Follow me again." And so I was immediately behind him on the edge of a river. And this river wasn't very big, but it was just the most beautiful, crystal, glistening river that you could possibly imagine. It was just beautiful and light, giving off the light like everything else was, and appearing to be living like everything else had been. And as I looked across it, I saw my father, who had passed away, and my brother, who had been killed in a car accident. And I began to see this whole group of other people, and some I immediately recognized as cousins who had passed away, a couple of uncles who had died, and then other ones that I didn't really immediately recognize, but I felt these four particular people, two couples, and I thought, well, those are my grandparents. And all four of my grandparents had died before I was born. And yet I knew they were there. And that was who they were. And they were all so happy to see me and wanting, saying, "Oh, it's so great that she's here. Isn't it wonderful?" And it just felt like a huge family reunion. And so I just wanted to be right there with them on that other bank of the river. But my guide again spoke to me, and he said, "No, you can't go there now. We have someplace else we have to go first." And since I wasn't directing where I was going and I was being drawn, I was drawn to follow him as he went down and around a curve in the river and into this opening. And once it came into the opening, this opening was filled with a beautiful, huge building that was pearlescent white. It looked like I would imagine that an enormous building would look like that had been Greek or Roman and had huge columns, white columns in front, and a whole huge number of stairs going up to this big doorway. And there were spiritual beings that I began to see that were milling around, heading, in small groups below the building, a couple going down the stairs, just began to see them. And my guide went up to the doors and said again to follow him. And so these massive doors opened, and inside, as we went inside, it was like an enormous library. And it was a very, very long area to go down. And in the middle of it were all of these different tables. And on either side, as high up as you could see, and it was as though there were no ceiling anymore on this building, there was floor after floor after floor of books and scrolls. And some of the spiritual beings were at tables and they were looking at books. And my guide said to me, "This is where the books of life are stored, but we're not staying here. We're going to another room." And so I followed him for the longest time down through this huge long hallway area, and then opened into another hallway, and then it through a door and into a much smaller room. And in this much smaller room, there were spiritual beings who were around what appeared to be like an oval area. And they seemed to be sitting as though waiting for us to come in. And once we were in, I just got this feeling that all of these individual spiritual beings knew me, and I should know who they were. And my guide said, "We're going to look at your life." And as he said that, the whole center of what should have been a table but appeared clear, it suddenly became like a hologram and a screen in which I could see my entire life. And from the time I was born right up until then, and not only see and re-experience it myself, but also see and be the people that I was interacting with all through my life, feeling what they were feeling, as well as feeling what I was feeling. And that was so amazing, because it just gave you such an insight that you don't normally get in terms of what someone else really deeply feels when you're interacting, whether it's positively or negatively. And I felt really badly when I was seeing scenes where I had behaved badly or hurt someone. And yet I felt no sense of judgment from all of the spiritual beings and my guide that were there. It was as though they were saying that that's not why we're showing you this. We're showing you this for you to understand how important it is to know how other people react and then go on to act to others like a ripple effect, so that you know how important it is to be kind and to be loving to others. And my guide said, "We're going to look at your life." And as he said that, the whole center of what should have been a table but appeared clear, it suddenly became like a hologram and a screen in which I could see my entire life. And from the time I was born right up until then, and not only see and re-experience it myself, but also see and be the people that I was interacting with all through my life, feeling what they were feeling, as well as feeling what I was feeling. And that was so amazing, because it just gave you such an insight that you don't normally get in terms of what someone else really deeply feels when you're interacting, whether it's positively or negatively. And I felt really badly when I was seeing scenes where I had behaved badly and or hurt someone. And yet I felt no sense of judgment from all of the spiritual beings and my guide that were there. It was as though they were saying that that's not why we're showing you this. We're showing you this for you to understand how important it is to know how other people react and then go on to act to others like a ripple effect, so that you know how important it is to be kind and to be loving to others, and but not for you to feel that you're to be punished or that this is bad or shouldn't happen. So then I was told that I could either stay there or I could choose to go back to my life. But if I chose to go back to my life, they wanted to show me some things from my future. And so they began to show me in the same way that I had seen in the past events, future events. And they said some of these things are definite, others are not definite, because every person has free will. And the people you'll be interacting with may choose of their free will not to act in the way we're going to show you things that are going to happen. But some things are definite. And they showed this all to me. And then I know that something else happened, but I don't know what, because the next awareness I had was of being in a totally different room with my guide, a much smaller one, and it was just him and I. And he said, I want to show you some things. And then he said, first, I want to show you. And then off to my right, I could see. He said, these are the prayers of people that are praying for you to survive this surgery, to recover, praying for your good, for your wellness. And as he said that, I began to see musical notes like you'd see on a score of music, like little black quarter notes and big round half notes and all these different notes. And instead of being horizontal like across a score of music, each note stood by itself, but attached to a note above it and attached to another one above it, and kept going upward as though reaching up toward where we were. Didn't hear any sound with this, only saw the prayers represented like that. And my guide said to me, each prayer has its own unique vibration. And so he described it as unique and a vibration, but I wasn't hearing music or anything. And then he said, I want to show you what's happening in the hospital waiting room where your husband and your kids are. And so off to the left, as I looked, it was as though I was looking through a clear ceiling of the room that they were in. And I saw my husband at a doorway talking to the surgeon who had operated on me. And I saw my kids behind by a small, like bench, couch type area in this waiting room. And as I was watching this, I saw that my daughter had thought that I had died and that she was praying that I wouldn't die. And so the prayer that she prayed became another musical note. And it was the last in the link that reached up to where I was with my guide in this room. And as that happened, all of my emotions flowed back into me of being Karen, being, the mom, being the wife, and all the love and care that I had for them just rushed in. And that made me decide, though that I was in this perfect love and peace area, that I still needed to go back to my life because I didn't want my kids to grow up without a parent like I had. So as soon as I decided that, my guide said, before you go back, you need to know that you won't be able to remember anything about what we showed you about your future, because that would change your own free will. You'd end up deciding things based on what you had been shown was going to happen in your future, as opposed to your genuine own free will choices. So you won't be able to remember those things, but you will have a sign. You'll have proof that this actually happened, and this wasn't, something that you just simply couldn't believe. So anyway, as soon as that was said, I don't remember any return trip to my body. I only remember being in the recovery room and waking up, and my husband and the kids being there, and me being instantly still filled with all this huge amount of love and peace, all of that I had felt when I was on the other side, and it was still filling me completely, and almost like a bubble of protection all around me. And so immediately I remembered my experience I had just had. But my physical body's consciousness that was coming out of anesthesia was very confused, did not know why I was in a recovery room, didn't know that I had had back surgery, saw my stomach completely from top to bottom with an incision, and bloated, and thought, did I have a baby? And, just completely befuddled. So that was the difference between the consciousness I had when I was out of my body and the consciousness that was my bodily consciousness as I came out of this. And then I was in ICU. I was in the hospital in total 12 days. And during the time that I was there, I got to meet the man who had been called to try to save my life, surgeon. And he, in fact, was the same man that I had seen in the hallway when I was told, pay attention to this man. And when I went to have the staples removed weeks after being out of the hospital, I decided that I was going to ask him about what I had seen. And when I did, he confirmed that, yes, he had come to the hospital in the way that I saw, and that he had been in his office seeing patients and had been paid stat to come to try to save this person whose blood vessel had been cut and who was bleeding out and needed a lot of help. So that was my story.
Wow. Okay, first of all, what an amazing experience. You tell it so well. I think it's incredible that you got an evidential confirmation from that doctor that this was really real. I mean, you can't make that stuff up, all those details and them asking you to pay attention. But the way that you tell this is so detailed. It feels like your memory of it. I mean, this happened, you were 30, right? So this happened a few years ago.
Yeah, I'm 74 now, and it happened when I was 32.
Okay, so this happened quite a while ago. So
yeah,
it doesn't sound to me like your memory of this has faded over time. Can you elaborate on that a little bit about how you feel about that experience compared to, a dream or something else?
well, it's nothing at all like a dream, or even everyday life experiences, because when I remember it, which it's part of me every day from there on, but when I remember it, I'm also almost literally reliving it. And so all of the details are fully, completely clear, and they don't change over time. And in comparison, when I think back to that hospital where I was operated on and also where I worked at that time, I really don't remember the floor that the physical therapy department was on. If I were to go back to that hospital today and walk in, I wouldn't remember how to get to it because it's just that long ago. But my near-death experience is totally different. It's something that is just 1,000% more real than what we normally consider real.
Wow, that's incredible. So let's go back to the beginning of your near-death experience. You're in that hallway and you hear the voice that tells you to stop and pay attention to the man rushing towards you in street clothes. Do you have any idea who that voice was? Was that the guide that was guiding you through your heavenly realm?
I think that it was the same voice of my guide that I ended up following later, but I didn't visibly see him anywhere, within that hospital. It was only the voice that I heard. But I do believe that it was his voice, because it sounded the same once I actually got to see who the person was. But I'm not certain. I'm really not certain.
Okay. You also mentioned that the man that was rushing towards you, the doctor, was talking to another man sitting on a stool who had those thoughts. Did you ever see that man and get any confirmation from him about what his thoughts were as he was saying, "Who's this guy rushing in?"
No, no, I never did. I never was able to. I think it was just some person who happened to be there, and and for whatever reason, I was able to hear his thoughts, and I never really could figure out for sure, you know, what the
Okay.
interaction was. Although the doctor who
Mhm.
I ended up getting in touch with again after many years, decades, I asked about, did he have some reason to slow down, and stop there? And, why? And basically he said no, he didn't remember another person at all. So that also led me to finally think that there must have just been thoughts that I was hearing. And then he said, well, I would have had, I would only slowing down I would have done was because it was an electronic switch to open the double door.
Yeah, that does make a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so you're going through the tunnel and you're in that black void and you see the pinprick of light and you move towards it and then you are suddenly in the light. What is the light?
I believe the light is God, our creator, and that energy of the light and of our creator is imbued in everything and just a massive part of everything and everyone that is there. And that that's all I can think of. Again, I'm not certain. I've racked my brain many times about what happened between the room where I saw my life up to that point and saw potential future life, and the next room that I'm suddenly in. Was there something that happened in that in between span that was important, but I was never allowed to remember it? And so I have imagined many things. I've imagined being able to actually see God and have God give me some more input about, you're going to be making this choice. You know, I just don't know. I really don't know. And
Yeah.
it's never been something that I've ever been able to remember since.
So you are in that realm that's all rocky, and you look down where your feet would be, and you don't see any feet. And then you step into different other parts of this heavenly realm. Was there any other time that you can remember looking at your arms or your body or seeing anything about what you look like?
No,
Okay.
no. I only remember even trying to see my body that one time when I looked down to see where was I and what was down below me, and didn't see any legs and feet where I thought I would see them.
Okay.
So for whatever reason, I don't believe that that was the way my consciousness was contained in something that looked like a body. Um, but I don't know.
Let's talk about that area with the meadow and the flowers and the beautiful trees and how light was in everything. I think it's so fascinating. I've heard many, many near-death experiencers talk about seeing colors that we don't have on Earth.
Mhm.
So, can you try as best you can to give us a little bit more detail about what the energy is that runs through everything on that on the other side?
I believe it's all a spark or an essence of God that makes true life within anything and everything. Um, and I think that that's, for whatever reason, it is light. Just like I said, my conclusion was that that enormous light I came into was God and our Creator. And I believe that some of that amazing light, energy, light, is within everything that lives, and even inanimate things, like the trees and things. Um, and it's amazing when you try to think about the colors, because I saw something on the internet once, and it was something that brought my mind back to the colors and the way the colors were with the flowers. And what it was I think it was described on the internet as an ultraviolet photo of a plant, and it had kind of like that kind of glow about it, and that totally different type of coloring. And it reminded me of it. It wasn't exactly the same, but it was something that made me think back that that was somewhat what it was like. So it may be that what those flowers are like there is we're able to perceive a spectrum of light that our eyes of our physical body just simply can't interpret and make any sense of.
I love that. That's a wonderful explanation. I know that there are insects that they say can see different color spectrums than we can.
Mm-hmm.
So that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I think that's the closest explanation that I can come up to, and it was partly because I had seen that internet picture of flowers here through that type of spectrum. So that's what I thought of, and
That's really,
I think that's the reason.
that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so now you're on the river, and across the river, you see all of your passed away loved ones. And you
Mhm.
said something about that really kind of made me think of a question I wanted to ask about your grandparents. You said
Mhm.
you saw the two couples, you didn't recognize them, but you knew that you knew who they were, and they had died before you were born. So it makes a lot of sense to me if I extrapolate this out. You were on the other side at the same time that they were on the other side before you came into this humanly incarnation. So it makes a lot of sense that we would have a recognition of souls that we knew before we came here because you had already spent time with them when they were on the other side and you were on the other side. Have you ever thought about that?
Yeah, I have, and I think that's a very good explanation of why I still knew who they were. And in the same way, I knew that I should know who the spiritual people were that were in the room and around the table type thing. And I came to the conclusion a long time later that they were what part of what many people call a soul group, and that they had helped me plan my life before I was born, and they were intimate soul connections to me, that I just was not seeing them in any specific relationship type of thing like I did with my literal genetic family members that I saw.
Sure. So you described with great detail the guide that you were following when you first got into the heavenly realm. Can you describe with as much detail as you remember what those other guides in that life review room look like?
I actually can't. I know, like I said, that I should know them, but on the other side, at the same time, I they were not presented to me in that room in a way that was indelible to me like it was with the guy who was my guide. They were just like the other spiritual people that I had seen outside the building and around at the tables as we were going by. I saw them very similarly, not anything really distinguishing them in a way that stayed with my memory like almost all of the other parts of my experience did.
So this happened in about 1982, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I'm thinking about technology back then, and here you are in this room, and you have an experience where you describe something as almost like a holograph. We wouldn't have had holographs back in 1982, from what I remember. So
No,
I'm curious, have you now, since technology has gotten so much more advanced, is there anything that you've seen in this time frame that looks kind of similar to what you described with your table and your holographic images?
yeah, just what I have seen of how holograms work, like in the is it the Star Wars movie
Okay.
where Leia
Yeah.
is projected out and
Yes.
appears. That made me think of it, that it was somewhat like that, and that's why, as I describe it now, and now that this point in my life when I know what holograms are like, that I use that terminology to describe somewhat what it was like. Oh,
So you have your life review. Now, life reviews are something that I really have focused a lot of my time and energy and attention to because I think that they have the ability to really make people think about what they're doing in their life. And it seems to be a huge catalyst for people who've had near death experiences to come back very different from how they were before. So I'm going to ask you something, and if it's too personal, you don't have to answer. But you said that you saw many different aspects of your life, some good, some bad. So can you start off and share an example that you remember of something that you perceived as being good that you witnessed from your life review?
yeah. It was from just one of them that stuck with me for whatever reason was from when I was in grade school. And when I was in grade school, I had moved to an entirely different town. And so I didn't know all of the other kids that were fifth, sixth grade, and they didn't know me. And so I was kind of left out of things and picked on somewhat. And I I remembered an incident where another girl who was the same age as me and in my same class, we had become friends a bit, and she had older parents who didn't dress her like the other kids dressed and stuff, and she was also picked on. And I remember this one day when some kids were making fun of her and making fun of her hair and and me saying, leave her alone. and standing up for her, and don't pick on her this way. You don't even know who she is, just please stop it now. And basically stood up for her. And we ended up becoming very close friends. And much more so after that. And the impact that it had on her was what I was able to see, to see that she then was basically, because of the support I gave her, was able to have more self-confidence, and that she did, continue on with her life and do things that she maybe had been too shy and a little bit too afraid to think about. And so that was one of those things that was shown to me.
Karen, I love so much that you share that story because that is such a really tiny, minuscule thing in this,
Oh
the
yeah,
spectrum of somebody's life, right? But these little teeny events, these little teeny occurrences seem to have such a big impact when I talk to people who've had near-death experiences. And I just think that the people are watching, need to be aware that our small actions sometimes count even more than our what we think are these grandiose big things that we do.
exactly. That's
I
true.
love
And
that.
that really came home to me a lot. You know,
Well, since you didn't judge yourself, and I don't want to judge you, can you share something that stuck out to you in your life review that was something that was more negative that really stuck with you?
mm, yes. Um, there was a time in my life, and my brother had married a second wife, and he had he was 18 years older than me, and he had agreed with one of my other sisters that if I was ever going to go to college, that he would help my other sister financially with that. And his second wife had a couple children of her own, and then my brother had two more children with her. And by the time I actually was going to college, um, he did not help out financially, and I was very bummed about that. I was upset about it, and I had gone once to his house, and I had been really mad and angry with him, and he literally, and with his wife, and I had said mean things to her. She had been mean to me before that. But anyway, he said, "This is my wife, and you'll respect her or you'll leave." And I did. I ended up leaving. And when I saw that, I realized, how my judgment was very clouded by my own personal selfishness, and that my behavior had been so bad in that case, and that she actually was very hurt by me. And afterward, I ended up, my brother was killed in that car accident, and I did end up going to her after my near-death experience and everything, and apologizing and stuff. But yeah, that's just one example of a negative.
That's amazing. Thank you for so much for sharing it because I know it takes a lot to be vulnerable and share these things about ourselves, but I really think that people learn from these so much. So I really appreciate you sharing that. Were you different after your near-death experience because of that life review? Or, I mean, I'm sure you were different because of the whole overall experience, but I guess what I would really like to know is how were you different because of what you saw in your life review after you came back to Earth?
Um, I was different in a lot of different ways, and not all of it all at once. Some of it came over time as because integrating one of these near-death experiences back into your life is really hard to do, because other people know the you from before you had the experience, and the you that you are after is conflicting, so yeah, I changed in a lot of ways, and one of the ways had to do with how I felt about religion and how I felt about God, punishing people that weren't having certain beliefs, and people being punished in the afterlife for what I came to call crossing all the T's and dotting all the I's. And
Yeah. Religions are very good at that.
yeah. And so that changed because, I was really very, very closely involved with other people who were very much into the faith that they have. And I understood that part of it, but they didn't understand how my experience could be anything but, like a delusion or a hallucination or something like that. And
Right, because it didn't fit in
made
with
it
what
hard.
they believed, right?
Right. So that was hard.
I bet it was. So I'm going to ask a question. So you saw those people on the other side of the river. Were all of them, in your mind, people that you would have expected to see in heaven?
No, as a matter of fact. And that was something that was really important to me in changing how I felt about things after my experience. Because at the time, right before having my experience, I had been into a whole development that I guess I called myself a born again Christian. And there were different people and television programs and things that prescribed what you should be and do if you were to actually end up being able to go to heaven. And one of those things that was described was a baptism of the Holy Spirit and Pentecostal church, think something like that. And so I thought that that was true. And I thought, well, then I'm going to need to have this baptism of the Holy Spirit. And if I don't, I won't be able to go to heaven. I'll be a piece missing. But then again, if I do, I know that my father and my brother and people that I knew had passed on had also not had any baptism of the Holy Spirit. And so I had this conflicting thing going on where if I was able to accomplish that, if I had to do that to be in heaven, then when I got there, they weren't going to be there because I knew they hadn't, so it was that push pull type of a thing. And when I was actually literally there and saw them there, that helped me realize that a lot of the worthiness that I thought that I was lacking and the steps that I thought that people had to take and accomplish evidently were not what I thought they were, because otherwise they wouldn't have been there. And that was very impactful for me.
Wow. I bet. I bet it was. I think that's impactful for a lot of people listening too. It's really good. That probably makes a lot of people feel relieved to hear that.
Yeah, since then, and I have had people contact me who have heard me share my experience, and they've contacted me personally. And a couple have been people that were just absolutely terrified that they were not going to be able to be in the afterlife because for whatever reason they hadn't met all the requirements they thought were requirements. And so, yeah, I realized that there are many people that have that kind of a fear like I did.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm so glad you shared that. Thank you. Can we go back into your hall that had all of the books of life? I'd like to talk about that a little bit. So you saw all of those books on the shelves. I know that they didn't let you have the memory of the things that they showed you from your future, but was there a book that was in front of you that was your book of life from this lifetime? And is that what you think all of those individual books was individual lives?
Um, I have come to think that um, initially, because I was where I was in my religious thoughts, I thought there must be, in the Bible, it says there is one book of life that your name is written in or it isn't. And
Mm-hmm.
if it isn't, then you're not someone who is going to be able to be in heaven and the hereafter. And instead, I thought, well, what I saw was very different from that. It was beings who were sitting at a table, they were looking at their book, and they were looking at a particular book. And so that I have, and plus my guide had said, this is where the books of life are stored. And that was plural and not singular, as the Bible verse had said. And so that made me begin to try to figure out or research for myself and find out, is there anything that coincides with this that makes sense with what I experienced? And so in researching things over the long years that it's been since then, I learned about what is known as the akashic records,
Yes.
and that this is literally what I believe that is where I was, and what these books and scrolls were is literal lifetimes of individual people that they are able to go over and learn from. And that also indicated to me that led me to believe that there is reincarnation, and that there is more than one life for an individual soul to experience and to learn from.
Yeah, I agree with you there for sure. I actually talked to somebody who wrote a book. He had followed a man who had studied children from all over the world who had remembered past lives as very young children. And he kind of went into it skeptically, but when he spent 2 or 3 different trips with this man and witnessed himself, seeing these children with accounts of lives, details, names of where they lived, cities that they lived in, even being able to they try to trick them sometimes and put somebody in a place that made it look like it was one relative, and then they wheel around the room and say, oh, that's my relative. And they would recognize people on the street. They'd be able to go to a city they'd never been to before and lead somebody to the house that they lived in. So there's a lot of information, and I'll actually share that video up here if people want to know more about reincarnation, because I think it's a fascinating subject. So
Yeah, and
let's Oh, go ahead.
I think you've heard people mention deja vu.
Yeah, it's one of my questions I have. Can you hold that thought? Yeah, actually,
Okay,
here's my thought I was going to ask you. You
okay,
said that you had that future and they didn't let you remember what that was. So I was actually going to ask you, do you have deja vu, experiences in the last 40 years that you think were connected to those future memories you weren't allowed to bring back?
absolutely, yes,
Can you give us a couple of them that you remember as the deja vu and you're like, whoa, I think that this was something I already knew?
yeah. I think the biggest one was within a couple years after I had come back from my near-death experience. My sister, who was 20 years older than me and was a teacher, never married, is the one who took in my mother and I after my dad passed away. And she developed terminal breast cancer. And I was with her, able to be with her a lot through that. And just finding out her diagnosis and all of that, when that came about, I immediately got one of these deja vu feelings of, oh yes, they let me know that this was going to happen, and I could be back for it or I could stay there. And I chose to be back for it.
That's interesting. So, do you think that we have multiple exit points in our lifetimes?
I do think that's very possible. Um, and so I think that sometimes, and again, sometimes that can be altered by other people's
With the free
free,
will? With the free will?
right, because perhaps one of the exits was at a certain age and it was through some type of an accident. And say the other person involved in the accident um, changed their mind, and they altered the fact that the accident didn't take place then. And so that's just one example of, I think sometimes there can be multiple exit points, and sometimes one doesn't happen and another does.
So, while we're right here, let's talk a little bit about free will. And will you explain from your perspective, because you do have such a unique perspective, what you think free will is and how you think it works?
I think free will is very important, and for whatever reason that our creator God has decided that we are to have sacrosanct free will choices, and that many of those choices won't be optimum, and yet we are free to choose them anyway. And that is just very, very vitally important. And that's why paths for multiple interacting people can change and can create a different life plan than maybe was anticipated. In fact, I think when people plan lives, it's not set in stone. It's not 100%, this is what is going to happen exactly this way, because that would completely eliminate real free will and free choice. And I just honestly think that the best we get when planning a lifetime is multiple different options, that when we're planning a lifetime, we are able to see all different types of potential outcomes and know that we're not going to know solidly which one it is. But, we decide to choose, and we decide to live a lifetime.
It's part of the game called life.
Yes. Yeah. Yep.
Oh, okay, I like to go back into your prayer part. I've read and listened to and watched so many near-death experience accounts. And there's only one other account I've ever heard where somebody visibly saw their prayers. It's very unusual that this happens. And I've
Yeah.
never heard anybody describe them in energy as notes. So you said that the notes, you could see them and you could see the whole notes and the half notes and how they were connected together. So what did those notes look like? Were they solid? Were they made of something? Were they energy? Were they light? What were they?
I think that they were not solid, that they were like representations visually, for me to be able to visually see vibrations. And so for me to think of and have it connect with how I thought, it was presented to me in that fashion. But it literally was vibration that was turned into a visual representation of a note, because I would connect vibration and music as one and the same. So that's the best way I can describe it. I know other experiencers have talked a great deal about the beauty of the music and the sound that they,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
I do not have, I have a much, much more visual experience. And I think that must have something to do with the way my brain functions compared to someone else's, or my soul's grasp of things, and the way it works. I can't explain it any more than that. But yeah, I've had people ask me several times, what did it sound like? What was the sound? And I said, it wasn't a sound. It was a visual representation to me.
Yeah. So you saw your daughter's prayer, is that correct?
Yes.
What did it look different than the other prayers?
No, it looked very much the same as the other notes. And it was just that her particular prayer and that particular note was like a form of completion. It was like there was this partial building thing that somehow became complete. And once it was complete, the entire power of it restored all of my human emotions, and really kind of sealed the deal with me making my choice
Were
to
you
go.
going to say no originally to going back? Do you remember saying no at first or having hesitation or thinking, I'm not going to go back?
I just remember feeling that I was so at home and so desirous to be with my dad and my brother and the others, that I knew how much they loved me and I loved them, and how perfect everything was, and how loving and complete and hard to put all the words together, that I just didn't have any inkling in intention toward returning to my life, um, until until my life review, until my um, being shown future, and then finally being shown the musical notes of the prayers, and my daughter's prayer being the final one. It was like a culmination of things that led me to have this unshakable decision that yes, going back is what was needed and what
Wow.
I wanted.
Yeah, that's amazing. So now knowing what you know about prayer, if you could go back and talk to your 7-year-old self about the experience that you had where the prayer wasn't answered, what would you tell your 7-year-old self about that?
Hmm. I'm not sure my 7-year-old self would be able to grasp it.
Well, what I
um,
guess then what would you tell the audience about what you've learned about the prayer?
well, I I guess I have learned that it's impossible for a human being to really get a full grasp of what a specific prayer that they're praying, or an outcome that they are praying for, means in totality for the rest of the family members, the life that goes on thereafter, um, because it is a connection of things that it's impossible to see from where you are at that point in time. And I've thought often since then. My dad and my mom both were high school dropouts. Okay, only my sister, that ended up taking my mother and I in, got a college education, became a teacher, and lived the life that she lived. Had my dad lived, my life would have been very different than what it ended up being. Some of it, admittedly, because he passed away, was very difficult and very hard. But some of it also led to me becoming a physical therapist, helping a lot of other people that might not have entered into my mind or thought patterns. Having the college education that I did, having all of those things that took place in my life that led me to where I am now, it would have been very, very different had he lived. And what that path would have been, what would be the positives and negatives of that, I really don't know. But it was important in his lifetime for his death to be at that point in time. And a lot of things that he was able to do from spirit that were beneficial to people have been reported to me. That wouldn't have been that way had he not left at that time.
Can you share a couple of things that were reported to you about what your dad did from the other side?
Yeah. My oldest sister had a daughter who was pregnant for her first child, and she developed meningitis. And the baby was only like maybe 3-4 months pregnant, at that point in time. And they said that they seriously doubted that the baby would survive. They weren't sure if she was going to pull through. And she told me, she has, told me afterward that when she recovered or was recovering from her meningitis, that my dad was there with her night after night.
Wow.
That she was going to be okay and that the baby was going to be okay also. And she, she was very close to her granddad because he was her grandpa when he passed away. My oldest sister was 22 years older than me. So this niece of mine was only like a year younger than me. So she was also very close to her granddad the way I was close to my dad. And yeah, she told me that was very much true.
So let's talk about eternity for a minute, because I think eternity is a concept that most people can't understand. Now, I haven't had a near-death experience, but I have had 18 very profound experiences out of my body. And in one of those experiences, I became eternity. Eternity wasn't a time, it was a state of being. It's almost impossible to describe what eternity is. And I know that you have a viewpoint about it. So can you share what yours is?
Um, yeah, a lot of us that have near death experiences will say that we felt like when we were there and in our experience that there was no time, that it was literally not a matter of um, linear time going from this point to this point. And I think that that's when you think of eternity, I think most people think strictly in the linear time that people exist in here on earth. And so therefore they think it's from here to absolutely unbelievably long, way long out there. And I don't believe that is appropriate. I think eternity is kind of outside time and yet is all time and all at the same time. Time, using the word, but
It's
that's,
almost impossible to get around it. It's so hard to
yeah,
describe.
yeah. And I think that's also why so many people have a hard time dealing with the thought of very difficult or painful things happening and making any sort of sense of why that should even be. But it's because they don't have that mentality of eternity being like an inability to perceive how much more there really is to a soul's experience, and that that there is a good reason for bad things, and that it's very important, and yet it's very hard when you're thinking in terms of 100-year time frame as being all of this bad things, but you're not conceiving of all of what eternity is like, an unending opportunity. And
I
that,
love that. That's beautiful. It's an unending opportunity.
yeah, and I think that's very hard for people to wrap their heads around, but in essence, that's really what a soul's experience is unending, constantly changing, constantly expanding experience and growth, and you know, and that's really what eternity is. It doesn't start here and end there. It just is.
Yeah, and I think it's incredible because when we lose somebody, we think, oh my gosh, I'm not going to see them for 20 years or 30 years or 50 years. But to them, on the other side, it feels like they saw you yesterday. It feels like they're going to see you next week. It doesn't have that same feeling to them. They're not missing us because there isn't anything to miss. But for us, of course, we physically do miss them.
Yeah, yeah.
So
It's
did you, oh, go ahead.
it's part of the human experience, I think, to be able to have that sensation of missing. Um, yeah.
For sure. So, did you develop any abilities that you didn't have before your NDE?
Not in the sense that a lot of other NDEers do. In terms of, I know many NDEers will have the ability to communicate with spirit, and others have other abilities. I just have kind of an overall knowing type of thing, and sometimes that does involve um, future events that turn out, but
Mm.
for personal lives, not cosmic or political or countrywide type things, and that is something that some NDEers have. But no, I just have the ability at times to just know that something is so, and that something is about to and will happen, but
Mm.
not really a lot.
Are electronics sensitive to you?
Well, that was the next thing I was going to say. As I have had, I've had that. I've had, electronic things that just, like, a group of us near-death experiencers met in Virginia Beach one time, and we all went into a restaurant and we were having a dinner together, and the big overhead lamp with the fan totally blew. And I've been in situations where other electronic experiences like that have taken place. And I had one that I remember personally. I was in my mother and father-in-law's house, and my father-in-law had passed away not an awful long time before that. And I had gotten up to go to the bathroom during the night, was in the bathroom, and they had a nightlight thing. And I was thinking about him, and the nightlight started flashing on and off, flashing on and off, and then it went off altogether. And I kind of said, is this because I'm thinking about you? And then it came back on, and then it flashed a couple more times, turned off again completely, and then it came back on and stayed on. And I just knew it was him. You know,
That's really special. That's really neat. I love that.
yeah.
You have shared so much today. I am so grateful for all of the anecdotes and stories and your lessons learned. So if people want to connect with you, are you open to that?
Yeah, I do give my email address, and I
Okay, I can put that in the
basically,
show notes for people.
right, which you could do, and I basically say to people, if you want to contact me regarding this, that you saw this, um, and regarding some questions or feelings that you have, if you email me, please put in the subject line, saw your NDE interview, because then that tells me it is someone who is wanting to communicate with me regarding something spiritually and or regarding near death experience. And I find over the time period that I've been doing this, that the people who do tend to reach out to me, it tends to be something that I can be of help. You know,
Oh,
not always, but almost always, there is something where I feel what they're presenting to me, I feel I can give a response that'll help. So
that's so wonderful. Do you have anything that you want to share with us that you're working on or doing?
I've been in a couple documentaries. There's
Mm,
one that has a little bit of an excerpt from one of my interviews, and things like that. But
that's
no,
nice.
putting out there myself.
I love it. So I want to ask you one last question.
Mhm.
Why do you think we come here?
Mm. We come here to experience a physical life with all of its limitations and all of its opportunities that are beyond what we can do just being pure spirit, and to have an opportunity to um, expand our consciousness and our ability to express the kind of love that's there on the other side.
Erin, you are a beautiful, beautiful soul. I so appreciate you. Thank you so much for spending so much time with us today.
Oh, I'm glad to do it. And it was great getting to meet you too, Lori.
Oh, thank you. And thank you so much to everybody who watched.
Yes, thanks everyone who watched.
Next up, check out this playlist of other NDE interviews. Please like and subscribe. It really helps this channel to grow so I can bring you more content. Thank you for watching. I'm so glad you're here.